I was a teacher fired for poor performance until I exposed the principal's grade-fixing scheme. But that moment of vindication was still 3 months away as I sat in Margaret Thornfield's office, watching her thin lips curl into what she probably thought was a sympathetic smile. The termination letter lay between us on her mahogany desk like a death certificate. 23 years of perfect evaluations, countless parent commendations, 3 Teacher of the Year awards, all reduced to a single page of corporate doublespeak about declining classroom effectiveness and failure to meet district standards. I kept my hands steady as I read, though my pulse hammered against my collar. The accusations were surgical in their vagueness. Difficulty adapting to new curriculum standards, inconsistent student engagement metrics, failure to maintain appropriate classroom management protocols. Each phrase had been carefully crafted to sound professional, while saying absolutely nothing specific. Margaret's fingers drummed silently against her desk calendar, a nervous tell I'd observed during faculty meetings for the past 5 years. She was waiting for me to break, to argue, to give her ammunition for the inevitable lawsuit she'd already prepared for. Instead, I folded the letter with deliberate precision and slipped it into my jacket pocket. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I studied her face, noting the slight twitch at the corner of her left eye, the way her breath had become shallow and quick. Fear. She was afraid of something, and it wasn't my reaction to being fired. I stood slowly, keeping my movements measured and calm. Her relief was almost palpable as I reached for the door handle without saying a word. But I paused, my hand resting on the brass lever, and turned back to meet her gaze. The color drained from her face as I smiled. Not bitter, not angry, just quietly confident. Walking through the hallways I'd patrolled for over 2 decades felt like a funeral march. Students pressed against lockers as I passed, their whispers following in my wake. Word traveled fast in Lincoln High. By now everyone knew. The great Mr. Patterson, veteran English teacher, mentor to hundreds, had been deemed unfit for his calling. I cleaned out my classroom with mechanical precision, each book and personal item disappearing into cardboard boxes, while curious faces peered through the door's glass panel. 23 years of accumulated wisdom, lesson plans refined through trial and error, student thank you notes that had sustained me through difficult days, all of it reduced to cargo for the slow walk to my car. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The first clue had been sitting in plain sight for months. During parent-teacher conferences in November, I'd noticed something odd about the grade reports for several of my AP English students. Rebecca Morrison's mother had been effusive in her thanks for helping her daughter raise her essay scores from consistent C's to A's. The problem was, Rebecca's essays were still C-level work at best. I'd been grading them myself. Then there was Derek Ashworth, whose father served on the school board. Derek's in-class participation was minimal, his homework sporadic, yet his official transcripts showed him maintaining a 3.8 GPA in my course. When I checked my gradebook later that evening, it showed something entirely different. I dismissed it initially as a clerical error, perhaps a mix-up in the district's new computerized grading system. But the pattern had continued. Students from influential families consistently showed grade discrepancies between my records and the official transcripts. Now, sitting in my empty house with nothing but time and burning questions, I began to piece together a puzzle that Margaret Thornfield had never intended for me to see. The district's grading system required administrator approval for any grade changes above a certain threshold. Every modification left a digital fingerprint, timestamps, and login credentials that created an unalterable audit trail. If someone was systematically inflating grades, the evidence would be buried in the system's backend, accessible only to those with administrative privileges. I'd spent my career avoiding office politics, focusing on teaching while others played power games. That naivete had cost me my job, but it had also made me invisible to those who might have been more careful around a perceived threat. Margaret had fired me quickly, efficiently, probably thinking she was eliminating a potential witness before I realized what I'd stumbled onto. She'd underestimated me completely. My first step was establishing credible access to the information I needed. As a terminated employee, my login credentials had been revoked within hours of my dismissal. But the district's cybersecurity was built around preventing external threats, not someone who understood the system from the inside. Jennifer Walsh had been the school's guidance counselor for 15 years, a close friend who'd expressed genuine shock at my termination. More importantly, she had administrative access to student records and a trusting nature that made her vulnerable to social engineering. I visited her at home 3 days after my firing, ostensibly to return some borrowed professional development books. We sat in her kitchen, sharing coffee while she vented her frustration about the district's increasingly political atmosphere. When she excused herself to take a phone call, I memorized the passwords written on sticky notes near her home computer, a common security vulnerability among educators who struggled with constantly changing administrative requirements. Jennifer's access credentials gave me the backdoor I needed, but I had to be careful. Every login was logged, every database query potentially traced back to its source. I needed to gather evidence without triggering security protocols that might alert Margaret to my investigation. Late nights became my hunting ground. The district's servers experienced lower traffic between midnight and 4 a.m., making it easier to mask my activities among routine system maintenance processes. I'd learned basic network administration during my years coordinating the school's computer lab, knowledge that now proved invaluable. The grade modification records were buried deep in the system's audit logs, hidden among thousands of routine entries. But once I knew what to look for, the pattern became unmistakable. Over the past 3 years, Margaret had accessed the gradebooks of 37 different teachers, making 247 individual grade changes. Every modification followed the same pattern. Students from prominent families, grades elevated by 1 or 2 letter grades, changes made during off hours when fewer staff members would be monitoring system activity. The electronic signatures showed Margaret's administrator credentials, with timestamps proving she'd accessed teacher gradebooks without their knowledge or consent. But the evidence went deeper than simple grade inflation. Cross-referencing the altered grades with college admission records revealed a systematic scheme to guarantee spots at prestigious universities for children of school board members, major donors, and politically connected families. The fake transcripts had secured millions of dollars in scholarships and admissions to institutions that would have rejected these students based on their actual academic performance. I spent 6 weeks documenting everything, creating redundant copies stored in multiple secure locations, screenshots, server logs, comparative analyses between teacher gradebooks and official transcripts, enough evidence to end careers and potentially trigger criminal investigations. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. I needed to expose Margaret's scheme in a way that would prevent her from covering it up or shifting blame to subordinates. The revelation had to be public, dramatic, and completely inescapable. The opportunity presented itself in early February. Lincoln High's annual Academic Excellence Banquet was scheduled for February 14th, a black tie affair celebrating student achievements and honoring major donors. Margaret would be presenting the prestigious Thornfield Scholarship, a $50,000 award named after her late husband and funded by contributions from the same families whose children had benefited from the grade-fixing scheme. The banquet would be attended by school board members, district administrators, local politicians, and representatives from several major universities. Local media would be covering the event, and the ceremony would be live-streamed for parents unable to attend in person. Perfect. I registered for the event using a fake name and credentials, purchasing tickets through an untraceable online payment method. My plan required me to be physically present, but anonymous until the moment of revelation. The weeks leading up to the banquet were spent in meticulous preparation. I created a comprehensive presentation documenting Margaret's grade-fixing scheme, complete with side-by-side comparisons of manipulated grades and original teacher records. The evidence was organized chronologically, showing how the corruption had escalated over time and directly benefited specific families in attendance. More importantly, I identified the technical infrastructure I'd need to hijack the evening's presentation system. The banquet hall used a standard audiovisual setup with wireless connectivity that could be accessed remotely by anyone with the proper credentials. A little social engineering revealed the technical specifications and security protocols I'd need to overcome. I also prepared insurance policies, backup plans to ensure the evidence would surface even if my primary approach failed. Anonymous packages containing full documentation were prepared for mailing to local news outlets, state education officials, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Deadman switches were established through delayed email services, ensuring the evidence would be released automatically if I failed to check in at predetermined intervals. 3 days before the banquet, I conducted my final reconnaissance. The venue staff was busy with setup preparations, their attention focused on table arrangements and catering logistics. It was simple enough to gain access to the audiovisual control room and install the hardware modifications I'd need to override the presentation system. A small wireless transmitter, concealed behind the main projection equipment, would give me remote access to the entire system, Custom software, designed over weeks of late-night coding sessions, would allow me to seamlessly take control of any presentation and broadcast my own content instead. The night of February 14th arrived with crystalline clarity. I dressed conservatively, blending into the crowd of formally attired guests as they filled the banquet hall. Margaret held court near the head table, resplendent in an emerald evening gown that probably cost more than most teachers earned in a month. She was enjoying herself, basking in the adulation of grateful parents and the respect of community leaders who had no idea they were honoring a criminal. I watched her work the room, accepting compliments on the school's improved academic performance and laughing at jokes from school board members whose children's grades she'd personally inflated. The irony was delicious. Margaret had built her reputation on fraudulent achievements, accepting credit for academic improvements that existed only on paper. Tonight would be her final performance. Dinner proceeded with predictable speeches about educational excellence and community partnership. I ate mechanically, my attention focused on the technical preparations unfolding around me. The audiovisual technicians completed their sound checks, tested the projection equipment, and verified the wireless connectivity that would soon become my pathway to justice. Margaret's presentation was scheduled for 9:15 p.m. during the ceremony's climactic moment. She would take the stage to announce the Thornfield Scholarship recipient, delivering prepared remarks about academic integrity and the importance of rewarding genuine achievement. At 9:10, I excused myself from my table and stepped into the venue's restroom, pulling out the smartphone I'd modified specifically for this operation. The custom app connected instantly to the wireless transmitter I'd installed, giving me complete control over the presentation system. Margaret's voice echoed through the hall's sound system as she approached the podium, welcoming the audience and beginning her remarks about the scholarship's significance. On the large screens flanking the stage, her prepared presentation displayed the scholarship criteria and previous recipients. At 9:17, as Margaret began introducing this year's recipient, Derek Ashworth, whose actual grades would have disqualified him from consideration, I activated my override. The screens flickered momentarily, then displayed a new presentation titled The Thornfield Grade Fixing Scheme, a 3-year investigation. Margaret continued speaking for several seconds before noticing the audience's shifting attention and confused murmurs. She turned toward the screens just as the first evidence slide appeared, a side-by-side comparison of Derek Ashworth's actual grades from my records and his official transcript. The discrepancies were stark and undeniable. Margaret's face went ashen as she realized what was happening. She fumbled for the presentation remote, clicking frantically as the slides continued advancing automatically. Each screen showed new evidence: server logs proving unauthorized access to teacher gradebooks, timestamps demonstrating systematic after-hours grade modifications, correlation analyses showing how beneficiaries aligned perfectly with politically connected families. The audience sat in stunned silence as 3 years of corruption unfolded before their eyes. School board members whose children had benefited from the scheme shifted uncomfortably in their seats. University representatives began taking notes, probably calculating the damage to their institution's reputations. Margaret abandoned the podium and rushed toward the audiovisual control booth, but the presentation continued inexorably. Screenshots of her administrator credentials accessing teacher gradebooks without authorization, evidence of how fake transcripts had secured college admissions and scholarships worth millions of dollars, documentation of how the grade-fixing scheme had accelerated in the months before my termination, suggesting she'd fired me to eliminate a potential witness. By the time Margaret reached the control booth, the presentation had reached its climax, a comprehensive list of every grade she'd manipulated, every family that had benefited, every scholarship and admission secured through fraud. The evidence was exhaustive and undeniable. Then came the final slide, displayed for exactly 60 seconds before the presentation ended. A simple message stating that copies of all evidence had been provided to state education officials, federal investigators, and local media outlets. The investigation was now beyond Margaret's ability to suppress or control. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 guests sat motionless, processing the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. Margaret stood frozen in the control booth, her career and reputation demolished in less than 10 minutes. I remained in my seat as chaos gradually erupted around me. Parents began demanding explanations. School board members huddled in urgent conversations, and media representatives rushed to verify and report the shocking revelations. Several families quietly departed, probably rushing home to contact lawyers and damage control specialists. The beauty of my approach was its completeness. Margaret couldn't claim the evidence was fabricated because it came directly from the district's own servers, authenticated by digital signatures and timestamps that proved its validity. She couldn't blame subordinates because the administrator credentials were hers alone. She couldn't suppress the investigation because copies had already been distributed to multiple agencies and media outlets. Most importantly, she couldn't retaliate against me because my identity remained unknown. I'd attended the banquet under false credentials, accessed the presentation system remotely, and disappeared into the crowd of shocked guests. By the time she realized I was responsible, it would be far too late to matter. I left the venue quietly, walking past clusters of agitated parents and overwhelmed school officials. Margaret's evening of triumph had become her public destruction, witnessed by everyone whose respect and support she'd needed to maintain her position. The subsequent investigation moved with surprising speed. State education officials launched a formal inquiry within 48 hours, while the FBI opened a federal investigation into mail fraud and conspiracy charges related to the falsified college applications. Local media coverage was relentless, with detailed analysis of how the grade-fixing scheme had operated and speculation about its broader implications. Margaret was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, though everyone understood she would never return to education. The district faced potential lawsuits from parents whose children had been disadvantaged by the fraudulent grading system, while universities began reviewing admissions decisions for students from Lincoln High. More personally satisfying was the vindication of my own termination. The evidence clearly showed that Margaret had fired me in December, just as the grade-fixing scheme was reaching its peak. My access to gradebooks and reputation for integrity had made me a threat to her operation, necessitating my removal before I could discover the truth. Within 3 weeks, the district's interim superintendent contacted me with an offer of reinstatement, full back pay, and a formal apology. They also offered a settlement package that included early retirement benefits and compensation for the emotional distress of wrongful termination. I declined reinstatement, but accepted the financial settlement. My teaching career was over, but on my terms rather than Margaret's. More importantly, the investigation had revealed corruption that extended beyond simple grade inflation into a broader pattern of favoritism and abuse of power that affected countless students and families. The criminal investigation concluded 6 months later, with Margaret's conviction on federal charges of conspiracy, mail fraud, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. She received a sentence of 4 years in federal prison and permanent disbarment from educational employment. Several school board members resigned in disgrace, while university admissions offices implemented new verification procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future. The Thornfield Scholarship was dissolved, its remaining funds redistributed to legitimate academic achievement programs. I followed the proceedings from a distance, watching justice unfold with the same measured patience I'd employed throughout my investigation. Margaret had destroyed my career believing she could eliminate a threat, never realizing she was creating her own nemesis. The final irony came during her sentencing hearing, when federal prosecutors read victim impact statements from teachers whose gradebooks had been manipulated without their knowledge. My name was mentioned specifically as the educator whose wrongful termination had exposed the entire scheme. Margaret's downfall hadn't been caused by external investigation or whistleblower complaints. It had been triggered by her own paranoia in the systematic documentation of her crimes. She'd fired me to protect her secrets, but that action had given me the time, motivation, and access needed to unravel everything. Justice had been served, but more importantly, it had been earned. Every late night spent analyzing server logs, every careful step taken to gather evidence, every calculated risk in exposing her corruption, all of it had been worthwhile. I'd lost my career but gained something more valuable: the knowledge that sometimes patient investigation and strategic thinking can triumph over institutional power and political protection. Margaret Thornfield had learned that lesson too late to save herself. The morning after her sentencing, I received an unexpected package at my home address. Inside was a handwritten note from Jennifer Walsh, thanking me for exposing corruption that had been undermining genuine academic achievement for years. She'd been reinstated as guidance counselor after investigators cleared her of any involvement in the grade-fixing scheme. But the note's final paragraph made me smile. Several former students had contacted the school to express support for my actions and gratitude for the integrity I demonstrated throughout my career. They'd learned about the investigation through media coverage and wanted me to know that my influence on their education had been profound and lasting. Margaret had tried to define my legacy through a termination letter filled with vague accusations and professional doublespeak. Instead, my legacy had been written by the students I'd taught honestly, the corruption I'd exposed methodically, and the justice I'd pursued patiently. That evening, I sat in my study reviewing the newspaper coverage of Margaret's sentencing, noting how the articles described the investigation's origins. According to federal prosecutors, the case had begun with anomalies discovered by a terminated teacher who'd noticed discrepancies in student grades. They never mentioned my name, but I knew the truth. I'd gone from victim to investigator to catalyst for justice, transforming personal betrayal into public accountability. Margaret Thornfield had fired me for poor performance, never realizing she was creating the architect of her own destruction. The lesson was simple but profound. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't immediate retaliation, but patient investigation that exposes truth and ensures consequences follow naturally. I trusted the evidence to speak for itself, and it had spoken with devastating clarity. Margaret was in federal prison, her career destroyed, and reputation permanently tarnished. The grade-fixing scheme had been dismantled, its beneficiaries exposed, and their fraudulent achievements nullified. The district had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. Most importantly, genuine academic achievement was being recognized and rewarded again at Lincoln High, while students who'd been disadvantaged by the fraudulent grading system received appropriate recognition for their actual accomplishments. I'd been fired for poor performance and had responded by exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of school administration. The termination letter that was supposed to end my career had instead begun Margaret's downfall. She'd tried to silence me with professional destruction. I'd answered with methodical investigation and strategic revelation that ensured her crimes could never be hidden or forgotten. It was, I reflected with quiet satisfaction, a perfectly appropriate response.